Good afternoon. Today is 20 November, the year 2009. I'm Dr. Dave Thompson, a volunteer at the Palm Springs Air Museum here in Palm Springs, California. As part of the Veterans History Project of the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., we conduct interviews of veterans and civilians who participated in our country's military conflicts, especially World War II. Today, I'm here at the museum along with fellow volunteer Harold Williamson and special guests Gabrielle Csiscery, and today we have the honor and the privilege of interviewing Sigmund Csiscery, who was a student in Hungary during World War II and later took part in the Hungarian Revolt in 1956. So we're going to talk to him about that, and Gabrielle also, about that and a lot of other things. Sigmund, so good to have you here.
Yes.
Gabrielle, would you come over and sit by that handsome young man there, please? Sigmund, would you spell your full name for us, please?
Csiscery.
And pronounce that again?
Csiscery.
Csiscery, okay. And Gabrielle, you want to spell your name for us, your first and your maiden name?
My name is Gabrielle Csiscery, and my maiden name was Gabi Semere.
How do you spell that?
Semere.
Okay. And for each of you, when and where were you born?
I was born in Budapest, 1929, February 3rd.
I was born in Budapest, 1932, January the 23rd.
And your ancestors, were they always Hungarian, or did they come from other places, or
They were Hungarian.
Okay. And your father, what was his name, and what did he do?
He had the same name, Sigmund Csiscery.
And what did he do?
He was an artillery officer.
Artillery officer.
Yes.
In the Hungarian army.
In the
there?
Hungarian army, yes.
And was he in World War I, or?
No, he was in World War II.
In World War II. I'm going to turn it over to Harold now. Harold, would you want to continue on? You can stay right there.
Okay.
That's fine. Yeah. And maybe I should move this over just a little bit so
Yeah,
you
it'll be
can
easier.
see them, but this way you can see the printout here. I can see this here too. Okay. Yeah, that's good.
Gabrielle, Sigmund, thank you very much for being here, and
You're welcome.
we want you to be able to tell some of your story. It will be especially unique for you folks to be a part of our history recordings here at the museum, because from Hungary we do not get a lot of people who are participated in the Hungarian Revolt. So you're going to be a very special interview.
Thank you.
And to begin with, how old were you when you became a part of the military?
I was in a military school starting age 14. At the end of the war, I was 16, and I discontinued being in a military school. I went to civil schools after that, and eventually went to the Polytechnical University and graduated as a chemical engineer 4 years later in 1951.
Fascinating. Chemical engineer. When you were, did you serve in the military before going to college?
No.
No. And so it was 1951 and you graduated from college?
Yes.
And what did you do after that?
I worked for a year in a photochemical factory, and then, because of my middle class background, I was considered by the communists to be unreliable and drafted by the military to work as a forced laborer, or you may even call it as a slave, in one of the constructions, and later in iron works, shoveling mostly the dirt.
Those had to be rather difficult days. Gabrielle, what was your background politically? Were you part of Hungary at that particular point in time?
I was in Hungary during World War II, yes. My father, he owned some land, and the summer we always spent on the farm. And in winter I went to school in Budapest, and during the war we were in Budapest. This is where the Russians came and liberated us. And then after the Russians came in, they took away our belongings, my father's land, and they also deported us because we were the enemy of the people. And so I lived in a deportation camp for 2 years. And over there we had to work in the fields, on construction in winter and in the fields in the summertime. And when Stalin died, we were able to go back to wherever we lived, but unfortunately not to Budapest, because that was one city we were not allowed to go.
I understand. Sigmund, how long were you in the concentration slave labor camp?
I was for a year, and then they put me into prison, and I was in prison for almost 14 months. And I should mention that I got for incitement, that is to say things against the system or something, only this so-called short sentence, because there was no evidence that I committed anything. The trial happened to happen after Stalin died, and after Beria was eliminated, and there was a so-called legalization of the system, when they tried to make things much more legal than they did before. And that meant that they had witnesses, and one of the witnesses simply said that he was forced to say anything bad, what he said about me, and not a single word is truth. Now that poor guy got, I believe, 4 or 5 years, and later I met him once through the telephone. He became a very famous doctor of lungs in Tel Aviv. And the other witness said that yes, he remembers definitely that I said on such and such a date that it is not a pity for Stalin that he died. And it was very easy to point out that by that day I was already in prison. So the judge considered there is no evidence, so I should get only this abbreviated sentence. I worked most of it in a coal mine. The coal mines, which were so unsafe that the regular miners didn't like to work there, were given over to the prisoner miners. Although we did have some civilian miners as well, teaching us how to do it.
And so how long did you work in the coal mine? That was considered a part of your punishment.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. That was part of the 14-month sentence. It was more than half of the time I was there.
And then after that?
After that, I had a very difficult time going back to work, because my sentence also carried a 2-year, how should I explain this? I was considered not to be a legal person, so I lost all my legal rights. I couldn't vote, and I couldn't be voted on, which was meaningless because the votes were 99.9% for the communists, and obviously nobody would have voted for me. But it also meant that I couldn't go back to work as an engineer. However, through a friend, I got to work as a laborer, but called a laborer, but I actually did the work of a research scientist.
And Gabriel, where were you at this? Had you met each other yet at that point in time?
Well, after the deportation, I did go back illegally to Budapest to work there, and this is where I met Sigmund. And then in 1956, during the revolution, I was in the city. We already dated at that time. I lived behind the radio building, where the revolution actually broke out and was fought at the beginning. So Sigmund came to pick me up, and he said it's not safe to live here, and moved me to Buda. And after a few days we were there, we decided that maybe we can leave the country. There was no future for either him or me to be there under the communists. So we decided either if it's safe or not safe, we'll try to go to the
leave the
border
country.
and try, and we were very successful to come out.
Well, congratulations. We're
Thank
glad
you.
to have you in America.
Oh, we are very happy to be
Good.
here.
Sigmund, when the revolution, tell me what led up to the revolution. Were you aware of what was taking place?
The revolution was unexpected in many ways. Changes started in September and early October in Budapest because the dictator was deposed, and deposed by people in Moscow, and replaced by another dictator. But nevertheless, it was allowed to say bad things about the deposed dictator. And that's when everybody realized that there are really no communists in the country other than the secret police and the higher ranking party officials, or even only a part of those. A few years earlier, actually it was quite a few years earlier, the dictator got rid of one of his ministers. This was at the time when Tito and Stalin started to fight each other, on the completely untrue charges that he was a Titoist. They hung him and 7 or 8 of his so-called partners in this non-existent crime, but people didn't feel too sorry. This was the Minister of Interiors and head of the secret police, but nevertheless, this was such a complete lie and arbitrary decision by our dictator that after the fall of Stalin, when rapprochement was made between Khrushchev and Tito, all these things came up to open, and they deposed and executed minister, his name was Reich, Laszlo Reich, was given a new funeral. And that became sort of an opening point when people saw that they are allowed to speak against the communist system.
So that was kind of the beginning of
This was a
freedom.
realization that things can be done. And then groups of poets and writers started sort of a literary discussion, which was perhaps a little bit of literary, mostly political, trying to prepare a change of a one-party dictatorial system to a more democratic one. And it suddenly exploded in October because the Poles had something similar at that time, and the Poles and Hungarians were always very closely and very friendly relationships. So there was solidarity, I'm using this word, but later it became much more important, sort of a friendship demonstration to the Poles by the technical university, Now, the technical university students were perhaps a few thousand, but by the time these few thousand went to a statue of a Polish general who led the Hungarian Revolution 108 years earlier, the crowd was in the many 10,000s, and I joined this group and I was there. And this is where suddenly the people started to cry, Russians should go home, and free elections, and etc. And after an hour or two by the statue, we decided to go in front of the parliament and demand the replacement of the government with Imre Nagy, who was a much more moderate communist leader, quite popular at that time because during the short period he was prime minister, he introduced a lot of changes and good changes in the system, still one-party system. We went in front of the parliament, and by that time there were, some estimates put it close to 100,000 people, and not much happened. Imre Nagy came once to a balcony and tried to tell that people should be calm, but he made the mistake of calling the people Eftarsak, which is what the Russians say to each other, comrades. And people say we are not comrades anymore.
No.
And then later he realized that this is now a completely new story. And then eventually there was sort of a decision, how could 100,000 people make a decision, that part of us should go to the radio building and demand 16 points which the university students put together, most important, multi-party system, democracy, and the Russians should leave the country. The Russian army was there. And another part, and I was a part of that, to go to the Stalin statue, which was an enormously big statue built by removing a beautiful little church on the outskirts, of the inner city on the Pest side. Now it was quite interesting that as we started walking, it was supposed to be quite a distance to get there. Trucks were coming home from work. They were unaware of what's going on in the city, and we stopped one truck and told him that would you give us a ride, and he said where, and we said we'd like to go to pull down Stalin's statue. I put his foot on the accelerator, went about 100 yards, then backed up, so get on. And so we filled his truck, he turned around and went back. And he went by streetcars which were full of people. This was about 4, 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock maybe in the evening. People returning from work to home at the same speed as the streetcar, and we were calling that we are going to destroy Stalin's statue. And every time the people sort of horrified and looked at each other, and then suddenly everybody started to say, let's pull down Stalin's statue. The streetcar stopped and people started to go in the same direction as we did. By the time we got there, there were many people there. I don't know, maybe 100,000. It's very hard to judge when you are part of the crowd. And they put ropes on the neck of Stalin and pulled it with the trucks. Several trucks pulled the two ends of the heavy ropes, but the rope snapped. And they put more ropes and the rope snapped. And then I was one of those who suggested to let's bring some acetylene torches to cut the knee. but there were others, and they were already bringing acetylene torches. This was sort of so logical. And they cut just above the boot, and then there was another trial. This was by this time it was 9 o'clock in the evening. And this time the ropes didn't snap, and the statue slowly started to bend, and then with a big thump fell down. And then there was a moment of silence, and then we sang the Hungarian anthem, and then everybody started shooting, and we ran on whoever was close enough and stepped on the statue. But just before all this happened, before the pull down was, a man came and stood up and asked for quiet, and he said that the group which went to the radio building was fired upon by the secret police with real bullets, and urged us that we all go there. So after the statue was down, we walked 25 or 30 minutes walk to the radio building. There were many people there, and the firing was on. There were secret police in the building. The students sent in a delegation of a few people to broadcast the 16 points. According to some, these boys were killed and the bodies were thrown out. I don't really know what happened, but eventually there was a fight with very well armed secret police inside and people on the outside. Then workers joined, and they brought some weapons from some weapon factory. And so we had some weapons. Then the communist government asked military stationed within Budapest to come, but they changed sides or donated their weapons to us. And I was part of a scene when there was this young officer, and there was this lot of soldiers standing there, and several of us were arguing that if we understand you don't want to get involved in a fight because that would be treason and execution, but give us your weapons. And I said, no, we can't give up our weapons. Then what conditions can you give us? Well, if you have overwhelming force, then of course there's nothing else we can do. And one of us asked, what do you consider overwhelming force? Well, you should at least tell us that you plan to use overwhelming force. Now listen, do you know how to use these things? And then he explained. And so we got all the weapons. I was carrying ammunition, I didn't get a gun. There were many more of us there. So we went back, I gave my ammunition to somebody who had a gun, into the house where she was staying. Because that house was looking down on the radio building. So
that's right, Gabrielle. You were right near. You
Yes.
lived right near the radio
she
station.
lived right there.
Mhm.
And we didn't know what was going on, so I was there for a little bit, and then I decided to go again down to get in the fights or something. But there was some shooting and darkness. So eventually, after a few hours, it was impossible to go back because they had machine guns. What the secret police did, they used ambulance cars and carried a lot of ammunition and new secret police within the ambulance. One of these ambulance cars was stopped and looked at, and they found the secret police, heavily armed secret police with machine guns. So after that, we didn't let ambulances go through. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, we finally got into a house with a friend of mine and tried to get back to the building to bring Gabrielle out. There was a machine gun just opposite to us, and each time somebody tried to get out of the gateway, they started shooting, and already there was a dead body right in front of us, which, since we had only one gun for everybody else involved, then one gun was eventually used to shot the light, so it was darkness, and then we could leave.
And you had Gabrielle with you at that
No, she
Not
was
yet.
still
You were
in
still
her
in.
home. And it was about 9 o'clock in the morning by the time I was able to get her out. She didn't bring anything, just to get out of here because we expected more fight to come. At that time, the last of the secret police were walking out with their hands up, and we were in the winning side. It took us a half day to get over to where I was living on the Buddha side because there was no public transportation. The communist government said a curfew, nobody should be on the street. As a result, everybody went out on the street, and there were people everywhere. This was the 24th of October. The 25th of October, things quieted down. The secret police was mostly beaten. The radio building was in our hand, but they had another place from where they could broadcast. So the news were coming from two directions and somewhat confusing. And there was supposed to be a big demonstration in front of the parliament. And a friend of mine, his wife, and the two of us were going towards the parliament. We were just crossing one of the bridges leading into the parliament, where we heard this machine gun, several machine guns, and we didn't go to in front of the parliament. People were running in such a crowd away from there. That was a massacre done by the Russian tanks which were stationed there. They machine gunned the peaceful, there were no weapons on our side, group, and when ambulance came to try to carry the wounded away, they shot the ambulance and the doctors. On the way back to Buddha, we had to do a big circle. We saw a building which was some party building with a red star, and two guys, we gave our hand, and the third one was standing in our hand trying to get the red star off the building. When the door opened and secret police came with machine guns, put directly into my stomach. And this man whom we were holding jumped into the neck of this guy, who then ran back to the house, and eventually we heard the secret police decided to leave on the back door and abandoned the place, and the red star was, of course.
Were you successful in bringing the flag down?
No, this was a star.
A star.
Yes, we were successful.
Well, congratulations.
And then this went on, but the next few days, now it looked like we were winning. The Russian troops were leaving Budapest. What I later learned, I don't know how much of it is really such, that they were not very eager to fight. They, some of the Russian troops were neutral, those in Budapest were fighting, and the division on the western part of the country said that this is your war, your fight, we wish you good luck, we don't want to get involved, and they just went to some forest and with their families. And the strange thing happened, this happened, as I understand, in the city of Győr, that the freedom fighters sent out a delegation. It's very cold in the forest for the women. Let them come back, and we will take care of them. What happened to these soldiers, especially with the officers, you can guess. I think the officers were shot. They were all withdrawn, and a week later, on November the 4th, came 4,000 fresh tanks and another 1,000 tanks in other parts of the country overran. By that time, Imre Nagy was the minister and the leader of the revolution. He took refuge in the Yugoslav embassy, and Cardinal Mindszenty, who was until that time in prison, took refuge in the American embassy, and he spent, I think, the next 16 years there. And Paul Malater, who was the military leader, or our military leader, and later was appointed as a Minister of Defense, went on to negotiate with the Russians on their withdrawal. They invited him and a few other officers. They were captured and later executed by the Russians.
So the American embassy remained intact.
Well, usually
So-
embassies are not.
Yes, they're
very
considered part of the
It's
foreign.
only in Iran where
Yes.
they didn't obey this almost international principle of embassies being considered sort of a refuge or something.
Mhm.
So then about 250,000 Hungarians. Now this is from a country of 10 million. And it is mostly the refugees were university students, upper high school students, young professionals. It's very difficult for people with families and children to start walking across the border, but there were some who escaped through Austria. Later the border was completely sealed. Some went towards Yugoslavia. We were among the first ones to arrive into Austria and among the first ones to get to the United States at the end of November.
And that was the end of the revolution.
But the
as we know it.
revolution essentially ended on November the 4th. There
Okay.
were sporadic fights here and there, strikes for a long time, and then the vengeance came. Many people were executed. Some who were captured when they were 14, they were waiting till became 18 because there was some Hungarian law which didn't allow anybody under 18 to be executed. Imagine that, waiting 4 years knowing that on your birthday you will be. There were really cruel vengeance after that.
On the part of the Russians.
Yes,
Mhm.
and the local communists.
When the Russians came in with all their equipment, at that point there were not a lot of resistance people.
There was some, but it was,
Yes.
I mean, when you have 4,000 tanks, there's not much.
It's kind of hard to
Yes,
provide
yes.
resistance to 4,000
Yes.
tanks, certainly. And after that, conditions in Hungary became worse.
Yes. Certainly, for many years it became worse, but somehow the Russians realized that unless they want another revolution, they have to ease the situation. Then slowly it changed to be the best of the satellite countries. There are certain freedoms were allowed which were not allowed in the at that time Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, or Poland. For example, later every other year people could travel to the west. It was a sort of an unheard of thing, even for Russians in those days, to travel simply by asking for, even they gave them some foreign currency. And a limited amount of private enterprise was allowed as companies, well, not companies, as a venture was small, it was able to function. And that, of course, improved the economy, and the living standards became much better than in the other satellite countries.
So Hungary really became the
Became a showcase.
yes
They used it as a
For the-
showcase.
for the communists,
Yes.
and they used Hungary to in an effort as propaganda
Yes.
for the rest of the world.
And some of the result was that Hungarians were very well aware of how life differs in the western part of the country. Also, foreigners could come to visit Hungary, so there was a mutual learning of how things are. And it was no accident that in '89 it was Hungary which started the collapse of the Soviet Empire by allowing each German's vacation in Hungary to go into the West by simply opening the gate at the Iron Curtain. By that time, actually, the Iron Curtain, a few weeks earlier, they took it up, and there was no longer
So it was a way for the East Germans to
to go.
go into
And
Hungary,
which-
and then
which
from
a few
Hungary.
weeks later led to the collapse of East Germany. They led to the removal of the wall, and eventually the Czech Republic changed, and the whole Soviet Union collapsed. In Romania, they made a sort of a revolution, and executed Ceausescu, and the more moderate
Yes.
group of communists took the power, and Bulgaria had something similar.
And that was about the time,
89. It
yes.
was 89.
and that's about the time when you came to America.
No, we came in 56 already.
okay.
So this happened many years later.
Okay. And how did you happen to come to America in '56?
Well, we had to go somewhere,
Yes.
and I decided I knew English, and I decided to come to the United States. And since we were among the first ones, we were very successful in getting a good job. I worked for 2 years for Monsanto in Dayton, Ohio, and I went back to school to get a doctorate at Northwestern. And once I get the doctorate, I came to California to work for Chevron.
Tell me about your escape from Hungary and coming to America in 1956.
Well, we walked.
You walked.
Yes, both of us. Well, we hitchhiked at the beginning, but the last part we walked. At midnight it was mud and fog, and we arrived to Austria, very dirty and muddy. The Austrians were wonderful. They gave us food, they gave us lodging, they gave fresh clothing and everything else. And eventually we ended up in Vienna, and I went to the American embassy. You know, Austria is a small country and just got reunited a year earlier, so we knew we had to go somewhere else. So I went
And
to the
Gabriel,
American embassy.
You made the trip through you walked through the mud, and
I came
you-
with
yeah,
him.
you came with
yes,
him?
I came with
that
him.
has to be a memory for you.
Well, it is. My dreams for many years went back there when I was coming across the border, because there were mines all over, except that for about half a year earlier they took out the mines, and they said our borders are safe. They made a showcase out of it. But we still didn't know whether they took up all the mines or not, and whether we are stepping on it or not. So it was not really without any danger.
It was frightening for you.
It was very frightening, yes. And the weather was bad, and it was cold, and it was raining, and it was...
Were there a number of you that were walking out together, or just the two of you?
No, there were a number.
A number
a
of you.
busload, actually.
A busload,
A
yes.
busload.
Okay.
We
The
got-
bus stopped on the other side,
mhm. And you had to walk the rest of the way.
yes.
Well, that was interesting, because we asked where the bus is going when we hitchhiked on it in some little village. And he said, oh, I'm going to the border, but that's all he told us. And we said,
To pick up
okay.
blood
Is
from the
that
Red
what he
Cross,
said?
yes.
So we said, okay, maybe come with you. So there were quite a few of us, and he said, oh, sure, come with me. And then he let us off at the border. And once we got across the border, Sigmund and me, a couple of hours later, we got into this house there. It was on the border, on the other side of the border in Austria. We saw the truck driver there. And we said, well, how come you came here with your whole truck and everything?
The bus.
The
It was
bus.
our bus.
He was there. And we said, why didn't you tell us that you are coming? We could have come with you. And he said, well, he didn't want to. He didn't want to
Maybe he
tell
was
us. He was afraid.
afraid.
People were afraid.
People were afraid. They didn't know who we are. We didn't know who they are. Actually, when we came to Austria next morning, they interviewed us. My brother was with us also. He was the third person. And they interviewed us separately, how we came out, what we were doing, and everything. They wanted to know whether we speak on the same language, who we are, and whether it's true what we say. And so once we went through that, they let us go.
Actually helped us a lot.
When they wanted to be sure that you were in fact who you were and that
Yes.
you weren't some kind
Yes,
of
and we were not,
spies or
because people
revolutionary.
started to come out from Hungary, and firstly those people came who were like communists because they were afraid. They were much afraid, so they came out.
The communists fled
well,
first.
Some came out.
Some came
well,
out, yes.
they
When
came,
we were on the winning,
Mhm.
some secret police people came out. At least the Austrians didn't know who they are, so they were checking.
they were
Eventually,
checking our
so many
background.
people came that I don't think they were able to check everybody, because I'm talking about 250,000 people.
So the real Hungarian Revolution, if we call it that America, because you received a lot of press and a lot of sympathy in the States
Yes, we
at that
certainly did.
particular time, and like you say, you were aware of that or you saw it later, and Americans were very hurt or skeptical and frightened for your people. Was there any evidence of American help during that particular time? Probably not.
None. Other than in the radio, they said. Well, later I remember hearing on the radio that there was a discussion in the Senate to find out whether Voice of America gave actual indications of promised help, and they concluded there was not. Those people didn't know how the receiving end we would interpret their words. When they were talking about America would like to bring liberty to these people, we interpreted that they would help us. And the radio of Free Europe and Voice of America and the BBC were constantly saying things which we interpreted, perhaps, or you can say misinterpreted, but we interpreted as promise of help, and
Which didn't come.
It didn't come. And I met many people in this country who expected that the country would get involved. And I remember one headline immediately after that said why I had to take the American flag off my car. It was somewhere in Europe, because he was so ashamed. It was a diplomat who wrote it, or I think it was a diplomat who wrote it.
So there was some anti-American sentiments after you got out of Hungary. You sensed that because America and some of the other Western European countries.
It was a big disappointment. I would use the word disappointment instead of anti-American. We expected help, and we didn't get help. Once we were across the border, we got every help from everywhere. And I would say that since this was a young and well-educated group of people, there was no shortage of places where people could find jobs. Germany, France, England, Australia, Canada were the biggest countries who accepted refugees, but there were I even met a person who ended up in the Dominican Republic, and it took him a great deal of time to get out of it. He was a mathematician. Yeah, some people went to Iceland.
Iceland.
Yeah.
Iceland?
Yeah.
Yeah, but they were happy, the Icelanders were. But this mathematician was a dealer in Las Vegas, I believe, and
He was
told
still a
me-
mathematician.
well, yeah, in a way. He said it was a big mistake. He went to at that time Trujillo, the local dictator, was in power, and he invited some of them, and he said it was just as bad.
So when you were in Austria, tell me from there how you happened to come to America from Austria.
It was very simple. we didn't know what to do, and we were walking around, and here was the American consulate, so we walked in and asked, well, what is the possibility of getting to the United States? And they said, oh, you are here. We just get the word that Eisenhower gave 5,000 to be flown immediately. And here are some, I was just going out because there's some people outside giving some numbers, and we get number 1 and number 2. And so we get on eventually on the second airplane, which brought in. We were just at the right place at the right time to get on an early flight. And so our plane a week later landed in Milwaukee, of all places. Planes were sponsored by various organizations, and this was the Milwaukee Catholic Church, which sponsored that flight, and that's how we got.
So
on.
these were refugee flights sponsored by various
flights,
American
It
entities.
was Flying Tiger Line, and this was this Constellation flight. I remember.
Okay,
It's slightly
a Constellation, a Lockheed
Yes,
Constellation.
yes.
Yes.
Two-boat props, I believe.
Well,
That was a long time
Constellations were
ago.
4-engine, yeah.
Yeah,
So you,
four-engine, yeah.
so you ended, your first American experience was in Milwaukee for the most part.
Yes, indeed.
And what did you do in Milwaukee?
Nothing really. We were released, went to Chicago. Since we were the first one, the Palmer House gave us a suit, where there
The
were
suite, okay.
the reception, and they learned that we were just about to get ready. So I think one of the magazines or newspapers wanted to photograph not a necessary wedding, but a scene of a wedding where they brought in a wedding cake, and she is supposed to give me the piece of cake.
Oh,
And
yes.
she was figuring that I must be very hungry, and took a very big piece. And I thought I survived the revolution, survived flight across the border, and I will die here in front of a camera, not being able to swallow.
Gabrielle,
it.
you were trying to smother him with a piece of
Yeah.
cake, huh?
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
Was
and then the same thing was at
And that's where you got married?
a week later we got
A
married
week
in Akron, Ohio.
Akron, Ohio.
Akron, Ohio. I had between 10 and 14 years I went to a Catholic school, and the class teacher was a priest, and he also left Hungary many years earlier, and he was at the parish priest in Akron, and we married at his church. It was a big reunion between him and myself.
I was going to say,
Yeah.
how did you happen to find him in America?
Well, we knew where he was.
You knew where he had
was,
gone.
yes,
Okay. That's right, because he left ahead of you, so you were able to
Yes.
stay in touch with him.
Mm-hmm.
Well, congratulations on your marriage in America.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And how many in terms of years from the time that you were living behind the radio station at the beginning of the revolution until you got to Akron, Ohio, what was the total number of
Not
years?
much, because the revolution broke out October 23, and our wedding was December 1st.
Okay.
So it's a little more than a month.
And the revolution really was a very short.
Well, this lasted till November 4.
Mm-hmm.
So how many is it? 12 days?
Yes.
October 30 was 12 days. Yes. Too short.
Well, thank you very much. You
You're
gave us a
welcome.
wonderful story and a unique story for the Palm Springs Air Museum. And congratulations, because it sounds like America has been good for you ever since you arrived.
Yes,
Yes,
that's true.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was a great
Yeah,
honor to get invited here.
Well, thank you.